I am Laurette Dubé, James McGill Chair of Consumer and Lifestyle Psychology at the Desautels Faculty of Management and founding chair and scientific director of the McGill Center for the Convergence of Health and Economic. It has McGill in the name because I just happen to be at McGill. The center is really a whole wonderful collection of action partner, academic, and others, policymakers, and so on from around the world that are concerned for saying, can we bring all of the science we can bring, whether it is life, bio, management, complexity, or computer, to see whether we can move forward toward a world where we are keeping the good side of the last 300 years of industrial innovation while moving toward more convergence between the economic that we have been looking as the key driver, but also the environmental, the social, and the health. This series, the Convergence Innovation Webinar Series, has been 3 years now going on. It was started with the first convergence innovation platform we created at global level, with all the actors in the food sectors as entry point. And we have since every month, more or less, convening top academic as well as top action leaders to see to what extent we can advance the knowledge of what we need to be able to act at scale differently toward this convergence. And today, and the webinar now has expanded. It used to be 1 hour, now it's 2 hours. And John Keogh, my co-chair, to whom I will shift in 30 seconds, has been working over the last year to really get further into what we can do in assembling a panel of related, as I said, academic or action partner to the topic of the day. And Erkko, John will introduce him. This presentation is particularly important because the platforms, the digital enabling as kind of seeing the world as a single ecosystem is quite challenging. And that's really what he will be pushing our thinking about how to really concretely move. So without further, John, I'm shifting to you.
Thank you so much, Professor Dubé. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. We're delighted to be back again with another exciting keynote and also panel discussion this morning. Before I introduce the keynote speaker, I want to give you an idea of the flow for the event today. The keynote will speak for about 30 minutes. After that, we will open up for some quick questions from the floor. If we don't get any questions, we will continue on to the panel, and we will ask each panelist to comment on what they just heard from the keynote through their own lenses. After that, we go into 2 series of round robins where I have 2 to 3 minute questions for each of the panelists. And I will introduce the panelists very briefly when we get to that section. We will reserve the last 10 minutes of the session for the keynote to do a 5-minute summary and for Professor Dubé to do a 5-minute summary and closing of the event. There will be opportunities for you to put your questions into the chat box, and we will try to get to as many questions as we can during the session. If there are questions that we cannot deal with due to time, We will try to address them afterwards. So with that, I'd like to introduce Professor Erkko Autio. He's the chair in technology venturing at Imperial College Business School. And his research focuses on digitization and the impact on entrepreneurial ecosystems, innovation ecosystems, new venture internationalization, and business model innovation. He has been cited academically almost 40,000 times, and his work has also been cited and referenced in The Economist, Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, and many, many other newspapers. So with that, I'd like to pass over to Professor Erkko Autio.
Thank you very much, John. And hello to everyone out there. My name is, as John said, my name is Erkko Autio, and I'm honored, deeply honored to be able to address this prestigious webinar. I wanted to talk a little bit about a silent revolution that not so many people are aware of, but which is likely to drive, I think, a major transformation in how we conduct and organize business operations. And I call this silent revolution the hidden dimension of ecosystem competition. I should note that my perspective is very much that of strategy and management, as John explained. I always try to understand a novel phenomenon and elaborate its implications for entrepreneurs and businesses. The phenomenon that we are going to look at today, that is the commons ecosystems, has much more wide-reaching implications for policy, economy and society at large than what I'm focusing on. But we do have a very high-powered and knowledgeable panel with deep and wide-ranging expertise who are able to contribute their own perspectives later during this session. So what is this hidden dimension? In short, I'm talking about the open source movement, which has virtually exploded in the past couple of years. Now I should mention a caveat here. As such, of course, the open source movement is well known since going back into the 1960s and even earlier. But the potentially transformative implications of its current incarnation are not that widely known. Let me give you some examples. In 2019, Facebook alone open sourced 170 previously proprietary software projects. That is 170 projects which were previously proprietary and handed out to the public domain. Open source is not limited to software only. The Open Compute project designs open source hardware for data center servers. It has received hundreds of contributions from large players. It boasts 12,000 contributing engineers, and in 2015 alone, Facebook reported $2 billion of cost savings and the savings of 400,000 metric tons of CO2 emissions from the project. That is the equivalent of roughly 100,000 cars emissions. Over 9% of Alphabet employees actively contribute to open source repositories. RISC-V, which develops open instruction set architecture for microprocessors, is today the biggest challenger of the world's leading designer of microprocessors for mobile phones, the ARM company, and promises to transform how the microprocessor business operates. And this thing is not limited to open source only. Today, Google and Facebook are the leading publishers of basic research in deep learning frameworks, or AI, artificial intelligence, and they fund and publish more scientific articles in this domain than any university or research institution. Why do they do it? This is not an altruistic move. They do it because advances in AI enable them to extract more value from their proprietary resources, that is data. Under the Telecom Infrastructure Project, mobile network operators are collaborating to enhance interoperability between their networks, even though this risks directly eating into their revenues under their current pipeline business models. So we have major transformations going on that are changing the logics of many software, platform, and infrastructure businesses. To return to the AI transformation, it is interesting that the majority of the world's leading AI scientists currently work for corporations. Note that they do not work to develop private research to service corporate needs alone.
Their drug.
They work there to publish their research in academic journals, so this is not private research.
It's actually quite an amazing thing to see, as the team has been working for so long. We've seen so many community members contribute to this project in so many different ways, and to finally
Can everyone on Kitty, can you move?
I muted the person that was interfering.
Okay, good. Okay.
Okay. So we have major transformations going on that are changing the logics of many software platform and infrastructure businesses. Here we have a little more detail on this data. Note that there's also a connection between publication activity and patenting activity. Publication activity is public domain. Patenting activity typically services private corporate interests. Patents are private IP, but note that many of these patents too eventually end up in the public domain. So we have Microsoft, who is a very active publisher of scientific articles in AI, with some 400 articles published from 2011 to 2016. They have issued roughly 2,500 patents, many of them directly deriving from those publications. Google showing similar patterns, as do IBM and Yahoo. Note that this data in this particular example ends in 2016, and many things have happened since. The Open Computing project is also very interesting. This project is silently taking over the server farms that operate the cloud, and it's creating massive savings, not only in cost, but also in carbon footprint. Server farms are massively energy consuming. The training of a single AI natural processing model, that is a so-called NLP model, natural processing model, consumes the equivalent of 125 round-trip flights between New York and Beijing. This is a dirty secret of the cloud industry, and the fact that major cloud players, Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure, and Google Cloud, are not required to disclose their energy use of data storage centers makes it difficult for their customers to factor this element when seeking to minimize their own CO2 footprints. We should also note that blockchain, or the distributed ledger technology, is another form of technology commons which, as we know, has its own non-trivial issues with carbon footprint. But that aside, this is a form of technology commons that is promising to transform conventional supply chains. Here is another, and this is a very fascinating example. I like this example very much. The French company Dassault's 3D experience platform provides access to over 49 million open source designs for physical parts for machines, industrial plants, robots, similar. Using this website and this platform, it is possible not only to design your own products and machinery using 3D technology commons, but it's also possible for you to use this website to build your own supplier ecosystem from scratch. And of course, we see new entrants disrupt conventional sectors with open source business models. Today it's possible for you to build an entire Tesla car in your bedroom. Now, if we overlook the fact that this would mean that you would need to have both a pretty funny bedroom and some quite serious hobbyist tinkerer skills and equipment, it provides a good example how technology common strategies can be used to drive industry transformation. One of Tesla's motivations, of course, has been to drive industry standards for electric vehicles, thereby enabling industry expansion and growing a larger cake for all to share. I hope these examples helped illustrate the wide reach of what we like to call the commons ecosystem phenomenon. For clarification, we distinguish between two kinds of ecosystems: value ecosystems on the one hand and commons ecosystems on the other. Value ecosystems operate on what we like to call the surface. This is the well-known domain of platform ecosystem competition, where suppliers, users and complementers interact around proprietary platforms and make money in different ways. This game is played largely under a proprietary logic. But those proprietary platforms are brought to life by what lies beneath, that is, the multi-layered digital infrastructure that can be found under the surface. This infrastructure consists of multiple layers. Here I illustrate software, data center and network layers, which themselves are again layered in their own right. This is the world where the commons ecosystems games are played, since this infrastructure is increasingly composed of technology commons. This is the world that gives life to the proprietary platforms on the surface. This means that the commons world and the proprietary value ecosystem world are intimately connected. Yet we know very little about how the two interact and what the implications will be for conventional industry sectors and industrial activities. Before I go into detail, let me offer a couple of conceptual clarifications. There are many different platforms of competition depending on the nature of the resources you compete with or for. First, commons resources are non-excludable. Everyone can freely access them. They are in the public domain. This separates the public domain from the private or proprietary and excludable domain. Second, the resources themselves can be rivalrous or not. Rivalrous resources are diminished by consumption. For example, natural resources such as oil cannot easily be replenished once consumed. Now, when we add the fact that when everyone can access these resources, then you can end up with what's known as the tragedy of commons, as competition for scarce shared resources triggers a race to the bottom, as illustrated by the case of bluefin tuna. With bluefin tuna stocks being depleted, everyone races to fish more and more to catch their share of the diminishing cake. In contrast, non-physical commons resources, such as knowledge, are not diminished by consumption. If you share knowledge, you still retain it. If you share code, you still retain it. So the same applies for open source software and also hardware. If you share hardware designs, you still own them, or you can still keep them. In fact, knowledge commons can even be increased by sharing, as sharing can inspire learning and further contributions to the knowledge stock or software commons, with the result that everyone benefits and the size of the cake increases. This sets commons ecosystems apart from widely studied platform ecosystems and conventional supply chains that operate on the surface, and supply chains often also being called as pipelines by platform researchers. Now, this was the area where I have been conducting my research recently. And here's the research setting that I wanted to talk a little bit about. We looked at numerous open source projects at different layers of the digital infrastructure with participation by Google, Facebook, or both Facebook and Google being very important players in the open commons world. We were interested in the following questions. First, what are the motivations for firms, not only Google and Facebook, but more broadly, to become active players in the commons ecosystem game? How is the game played? And how does the commons ecosystem dynamic connect with the value ecosystem game that is played on the surface? And here is what we found. We found 3 kinds of motivations to play the commons ecosystem game. These were operational, community level, and strategic motivations. As such, operational motivations are quite well known already and include things such as reduced cost of software development, increased speed of software development, ability to attract and motivate employees who like the commons world, excuse me, enhanced development capabilities. And this is actually nicely illustrated in the quote you see on the slide from Facebook. Facebook says, we find we write better, cleaner code. We are forced to create more modular, pluggable technologies that can work both within and outside the Facebook infrastructure. So these were some of the benefits that can be listed under the operational motivations to join the commons ecosystem game. Community level motivations had to do with contributing to and leveraging the commons ecosystem community. Here we talk about boosting the generation of technology commons and mobilizing commons resources towards resolving bottlenecks that matter to us. We contribute to the community because that way also others are encouraged to contribute and everyone benefits. So an example of mobilization activities, we have Google, who previously released Kubernetes, which is a software project designed to help manage containerization in server farms. And in order to help build momentum around that Kubernetes ecosystem, Google also released Istio and native software projects, because these software projects complement the Kubernetes ecosystem, enhancing its features and thereby helping building momentum around Kubernetes. And finally, and this is perhaps most interesting, we have strategic motivations. These include ability to extract more value from our proprietary resources, as in the case of Google and AI. We can also expand our offerings to new customer audiences, which is the objective of the telecoms infrastructure project. We can undermine our competitors' proprietary offerings, as Apple, Amazon, and others are doing with OpenStreetMaps, which offers an open source alternative to Google's proprietary Google Maps, thereby undermining it. Google did the same to Nokia when it released its Android operating system in 2007. At the time, Nokia owned 40% of the world's smartphone market, but its control was based on proprietary control of the supply chain and Symbian operating system. Android shifted control away from the supply chain to the mobile interface and transformed mobile business into a software, apps, and data business. Now, Google was able to do this because Google makes its money from proprietary user data, which Nokia didn't have. Finally, a strategic motivation is to eliminate vendor dependence and also to proactively block future competitors by converging new domains to a commons logic from the outset by going open first. Thinking about the strategic implications of all this, it is important to recognize that the commons and value ecosystem dynamics are intimately connected, yet they follow very different logics. So we have an illustration here. The commons logic is illustrated on this slide with the machine learning or AI commons on the right, where numerous participants make contributions towards AI science and algorithms, so they contribute code. that can be harnessed by different players to maximize value extraction from data. So we have Open's logic on the right that has its own logic. We have Commons dynamic that has its own logic. And then we have value dynamic that has its own proprietary logic. Note that in this particular case, the dynamic also shifting the emphasis of value creation away from proprietary algorithms and software towards proprietary data, explaining, and which also helps explain some of the digital incumbents' motivations in AI research as illustrated earlier. Thinking about wider strategic implications, there are many different ways with which digitalization can transform conventional industry sectors. Here are just a few examples. We know that conventional manufacturing businesses can be servitized by introducing new business models. For example, instead of buying a car, we can rent one. And that's a service business model that's built on top of the car manufacturing pipeline. Physical equipment can sometimes also be directly converted into a digital service through codification, as illustrated by the conversion of the conventional typewriter into a codified digital software functionality. Physical services can be converted into digital platforms through codification, as illustrated by multiple fintech examples such as TransferWise, who specializes in speedy and low-cost currency conversions, currency exchange. Earlier I mentioned Dassault's 3D experience, which is a fascinating example because this platform is helping convert entire manufacturing pipelines into a digital platform by harnessing servitization, codification, commonalization, that is the conversion of proprietary resources into commons ones, and platformization dynamics. And closed-source software businesses can be converted into platform services built on open source, as is the case of WordPress and its digital editing platform. The key message here is that digital transformations of sectors can take many different forms, and commonalization is likely to play an increasing role in driving such transformations. And note that with these transformations, also the sources of control and therefore drivers of competitive advantage are also likely to change. So from manufacturing assets being the source of control in manufacturing pipeline sectors, physical service capabilities in physical service sectors, proprietary source code in software businesses, and finally platforms and data in digital platforms. Now, although we predict that commonalization is going to play an increasingly important role in driving digital transformation, this transformation is not likely to be painless, because we have a collision of the public and private worlds. In our research, we have observed that the commons logic and the proprietary value system ecosystem logics often clash. Clashes are likely to emerge when previously proprietary domains are being converted to commons, thereby shifting key drivers of competitive advantage, and also when profit-oriented players try to exercise self-interested control over the commons dynamic. Specifically, we observed 4 maneuvers that were commonly used in the commons ecosystem game. Scaling maneuvers sought to set the commons dynamic in motion in the first place by open sourcing software and complementary resources, and by enabling participative governance of the commons resource. Sponsoring maneuvers sought to build momentum around existing commons communities through championing the OS project, through the promotion to attract new participants and contributors, by donating funding, and by contributing in-house designers to ecosystem activities. On the private side, through scheming maneuvers, some digital incumbents sought to exercise control over the commons dynamic, sometimes at the expense of the wider commons community. This often gave rise to clashes as the community responded with shaming maneuvers, trying to force the offending parties back to line. Such tensions reflected the uneasy marriage between public domain resources and private sector profit generation logics. So, how should one play the commons game? So we offer a 5-step roadmap to what we call commons grand mastery, a grandiose term. At the beginner level, and this is I'm talking about firm level activities here. At the beginner level, you should seek to maximize firm level benefits by starting to use commons technologies. You can achieve cost savings, you can speed up development, and you can do this to reduce vendor dependence. To do this, you need to ensure that your legal team is up to speed with technology commons licensing, and you need to educate your management of the benefits of commons. At the intermediate level, you seek to become a visible contributor to the commons. Now you do this to attract the best developers, upgrade your software skills, and build your reputation. To make this happen, you need to establish an open source program office and have clear policies regarding how you contribute and where you contribute. You need to carefully select the projects to participate in. At the advanced level, you start pursuing commons leverage. This means you try to steer the commons ecosystem momentum by mobilizing contributors in select projects and directing efforts towards important bottlenecks that matter to you. To do this, you need to build a more public profile, become a commons ecosystem leader, and actively promote the commons ecosystem. At the master level, you use the commons dynamic to boost your strategic position and undermine proprietary competition. Now you are harnessing commons to play a three-dimensional strategic chess game against proprietary competitors. You harness commons to steal users from proprietary competitors, you undermine competitors' proprietary assets, and you proactively block competitors from gaining future dominance. Now you need to integrate the commons game plan closely with your company's strategy. You need to establish coalitions to undermine competitors, and you need to extend the commons logic to new domains. MySQL's move to go commons to establish itself as industry standard was a masterstroke. For those of you who don't know MySQL, they developed a database software application for the then novel laptop environment and desktop environment. Initially, they tried to sell their software as conventional closed-source software by printing the assembler code onto a DVD, putting the DVD into a box, and then trying to sell the box. And they made no progress whatsoever. It was a complete disaster. Then they decided to put the source code of MySQL application on their website to be freely downloaded by anyone and used under the copyleft license. Sooner than they knew it, they had millions of users, and they found that they were now the de facto industry standard. A couple of years later, Sun Microsystems acquired MySQL, and subsequently Oracle acquired Sun because of MySQL. At the Grandmaster level, you make the strategic chess game three-dimensional and future-oriented. You manipulate the digital infrastructure widely to establish positions of future dominance in unrelated sectors. You build and exploit cross-layer and cross-domain leverage by leveraging commons across multiple layers of the digital infrastructure and by extending the commons logic to distant domains and sectors. You initiate and lead new commons projects and address multiple bottlenecks across layers and domains. you proactively shape the digital infrastructure in a sweeping way. This is what Google did for the mobile sector with Android, and this seems to be what Amazon appears to be trying to do for the industrial Internet of Things, the IIoT sector, which today remains dominated by close proprietary systems providers such as ABB and Siemens. Okay, final thoughts, and to conclude, main point here is that the commons logic, I hope I have been able to persuade you on this, that the commons logic is expanding rapidly, yet most firms remain blissfully unaware of this phenomenon. And this is dangerous because the rapid adoption of IIoT will cause the commons logic and competition, commons mode of competition, to increasingly spread into non-digital sectors too. So it is time to start preparing or risk becoming victim to an attack from beneath. Risk to which, as I mentioned earlier, I believe many leading closed source providers of IIoT systems are currently exposed. Okay, this was my presentation. Thank you for your attention, and now I should give the screen back to the moderator.
Thank you so much for that, Professor Autio. Fantastic discussion, very broad. Let me ask the attendees if they have any questions. If not, I will go to the first panelist. Okay, I see one.
Don, if I may ask a quick question.
Yes.
Am I allowed? Yes. Okay.
You have a question?
Yeah,
Laura?
okay. Yeah, a question. Erkko, thank you very, very much. Very insightful for the type of things we are trying to move forward. One question to you is that where you have the public non-dividable, whatever, you see this from as a tragedy of the commons, which is very much Elinor Ostrom, before Elinor Ostrom, along the line of if you cannot capture the value, then you don't care if you are destroying it and so on. And that aspects of the public value that is out there, whether it is the air that we breathe or whatever, is not without value in the current ecosystem. And your model is looking at either the common that is put out there and the private, what you call value, and correct me if I'm wrong, is essentially the private value capture ecosystem. But what about the whole of the public value also in creating an ecosystem that can allow moving forward? That's I'd like to hear what you think about this.
Thank you. I think that's a great observation and great question. What I think about it is that it's very interesting. Much of this commons logic and commons dynamic is enabled by the shift towards more knowledge-intensive resources. So we are increasingly moving value creation and functionality creation away from physical world and physical resources to knowledge resources. And as I mentioned earlier, knowledge resources have the interesting feature of being replenished and increased through sharing. Physical resources get diminished by consumption, knowledge resources get grown by consumption. Mm-hmm. And that's a great dynamic because that has direct implications for sustainability, for example. So this commons dynamic is helping convert conventional pipeline industries into platform industries. I'm not saying that is the only driver of it, but it's certainly facilitating that conversion. And thereby, it's also facilitating the conversion of the conventional pipeline dynamic into a more circular dynamic and more sustainable circular dynamic, because now commons resources you can share. What Facebook did previously when they run their server farms, closed source server farms, is that once the servers came to the end of their life cycle, they were thrown away because they were not compatible with anyone else's hardware. Now those same servers, they can be recycled. So Facebook uses them for 2 to 3 years, and then they are recycled and taken into use by someone else. So I think there's a positive interaction and positive dynamic there that helps drive the creation of public value.
Okay, very good. That's what I was hoping to hear. Back to you, John.
Thank you so much for that. Now, Richard Black, Professor Richard Black is on the call with us as well. You're on as an observer for us today, and you have adjunct roles at McGill and Tufts. I wonder, do you have a quick question for?
Yeah, thank you very much, John. I usually wouldn't ask a question at this point, but phenomenal talk. I'm sure I'm not alone in the industry when I say it's really hard to change the culture within an established company to understand the value of the commons. Any thoughts on the approach that can be taken within an established, not so much like a Tesla's a new company, I get it. I'd be really interested in hearing your thoughts on that.
I think your observation is exactly to the point, and it hits the nail on the head. So this proprietary mentality in conventional sectors and even in some digital sectors is very deeply rooted. What can you do to address that? I've been talking to IIoT systems providers, for example, and I'm not sure that they fully understand the risk to which they are exposed at the moment, because this proprietary culture and mindset is so deeply embedded in that sector. Well, what can you do about it? That's a very tricky question. Obviously, you can try to educate. You can try to do demonstrations and similar, but it's a big challenge. So I would expect and venture to guess that a lot of this transformation will be carried by new entrants who might have more open mindsets.
Wonderful.
That's my guess anyway. So there's no easy answer to that question, obviously.
Fair enough. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you, Professor, for that. I'll take one more quick question while I ask Branimir to open up his video. There's a question here, Professor, from Yevgeny. I don't know if you can see it. And he says there are entire industries which are based on open source, DeFi and blockchain, for example. Are you saying that commons is not recognized within those sectors?
Well, I think that's a very valuable point. So what we are seeing is that this transformation is increasingly happening in some sectors. It's happening more quickly than in other sectors. Overall, the phenomenon, if you look at conventional industry sectors, that is very much underneath. I've been speaking to many leaders in the software industry, for example, who are completely blind to this phenomenon. Blockchain is a special case, and blockchain is something that is in its own right a commons as such, and it promises to deliver an impact and maybe start impacting other sectors also. So far, what we have seen in blockchain is that it tends to remain a fairly niche activity in terms of cross-sectoral impact at the moment. That is my take on the blockchain industry anyways.
Wonderful, thank you for that. So for the benefit of the audience today, we have decided to go through our panelists based on alphabet. So the first, based on the first name. And the first one that comes out of the hat is Branimir Rakic. Now, Branimir is the founder and CTO of Trace Labs, who are the core developers of the open source platform, which is Origin Trail. And he's been doing some tremendous work for a number of years. And so, Branimir, if you can come off mute and talk about what you've seen, what you have heard, and if I can ask you to keep it within a 2 to 3 minute window.
Yeah, thank you, John, and thanks for the great presentation. It was exciting to see from a different perspective a lot of the things that we've been actually interacting with in, let's say, the real world of supply chain businesses. And I absolutely agree on the comment of blockchain in a sense being very niche and not touching this traditional space, which is not as aware of open common systems being built, though they are increasingly being aware due to just new implementations happening. And it's, again, a new technology. We've, as Trace Labs, had quite an interesting journey there, and specifically when it comes to knowledge commons. That's where we have mostly specialized, because we built technologies that are enabling knowledge sharing, or in a different way, data sharing. This is really to focus on three main things: solving issues of interoperability, interconnectivity, and integrity in supply chains. And that's due to really stemming down from traditional IT systems, the ones that we would not classify as commons, being data silos in a way. That's how you, for example, that's why you're not able to see fully transparent information on supply chains, or specifically food supply chains that we are discussing today. And solving this will actually require achieving interoperability, interconnectivity, and integrity. Finally getting into these knowledge commons. We are building the Origin Trail Decentralized Knowledge Graph, which is actually a completely open source, permissionless commons network being run by almost 800 different entities around the world at this point, entering into version 5 in a couple of weeks. And that's being run by both businesses as well as individuals who contribute to this. And it's been a wonderful journey, but not to take over too much of the time. If we touch upon the knowledge commons discussion later, I'm sure there will be interesting examples I could give on how we've been implementing technologies with major retailers in the US and companies in, for example, in the rail industry in Europe.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Branimir. And for sure, the open source journey is only at the beginning. So if I may ask Dennis to open up. Dennis Lasco is the Fresh Supply Chain Innovation Manager at Ahold Delhaize, USA. And Dennis is also the founder of Pantry, and he's a former McKinsey consultant. So Dennis, in 2 to 3 minutes, if you can comment on Professor Autio's briefing from your perspective.
Yes, great briefing, and certainly as I was listening, I felt it was very relevant to what we see at Ahold. So as the supply chain innovation manager, every day I'm talking to these brilliant minds and innovators who are building Teslas in their bedrooms, and I'm the guy who has to figure out how to drive it out of the bedroom. And into our warehouses, and at the same time, Ahold Delhaize is a merger of 5 companies over the past decade: Stop and Shop and Hannaford and Food Lion and our great local brands. And with that comes a lot of legacy systems that we can't simply eliminate overnight. And really what I see as relevant to us is platforms become the way for linking these legacy systems with these new technologies. I'll give a simple example, and I have many more that perhaps I'll bring up in the later sessions, but as we go through our supply chain transformation to create one supply chain for 5 brands, we look for a warehouse management system. And that warehouse management system has to talk to new technologies such as IoT sensors that detect ethylene respiration in fruit and allow me to sequence by ripeness as opposed to FIFO, which in the fruit industry can be very different things. At the same time, it has to talk to my legacy temp monitoring software within my warehouse, my Siemens that Erkko mentioned, and other temp monitoring devices that have been in my warehouses for 20, 30 years. And new things down the pike, the traceability that's being required from DC to store by the FDA in the US has to talk to my warehouse management system so I can know which lot is sitting where in the event of a recall. So when we source that that legacy, that warehouse management system, we have to have a platform, and we have to, and when we source those new technologies, we have to ensure that they talk to the platform that we're building.
Gotcha. Thank you, Dennis. May I ask, I'm going to ask you a quick question, Dennis, but if Erthrin can open up a video, please. So Dennis, are the days of the massive capital expense gone for retailers, where you're buying the software and it costs you $10 million or $20 million?
John, I wish.
You wish?
I think the days of those kinds of expenditures being for static systems are over. So we're upgrading our forecasting and replenishment system, and that is costing untold millions of dollars. But it's again, just like our warehouse management system, it's a platform that we can build onto, that we can take away from. So I think while we're in the unique position of undergoing a major supply chain transformation that will mothball a lot of standalone systems and replace them with more platform systems, I think in the future we'll see less and less of those kinds of massive expenditures and more bolt-ons and modifications.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dennis. So our next panelist is Erthrin Cousin. Now, Erthrin, we're so delighted to have you, because your background is very rich. I can't even begin to describe and do the intro. I wouldn't do you justice, but you are leading the future, the food systems of the future, but you're also the former US ambassador to the United Nations food programs, and literally have been out there trying to solve some of these big challenges. What is your lens on the presentation from Professor Autio?
Well, first of all, let me thank Professor Autio for a truly enlightening presentation. And to say your presentation worries me significantly. And I start by the opening slides where you acknowledge the shift in where the personnel, where the leading thinkers in this space are now located. And they're not in academic institutions. They're inside a handful of companies that, yes, are benefiting from the commons, but because of the personnel, the publications that they're doing in these institutions, it provides the opportunity for them also to derive the value from the commons for their own proprietary and private sector interest. And that should worry us all, because what's the potential for the growth of the commons to create even more disparity in the who generates, who has the ability to create value from what is in those open source systems becomes seemingly ever more limited. And that was underscored even more for me in your mastering of the commons slide, where even with the beginner through the Grand Master, there was a certain level of legal, financial, and intellectual capital required in order for any entity to benefit from the commons. Even at the beginner level, you need a certain level of legal and intellectual support to fully value, to value what you can derive from the commons. And so that gets me right into the work that we're doing at FSF, which is how do we create, which is building a platform to support the opportunity for a broader dissemination of this kind of value in the agriculture section of the commons for the benefit of poor and underserved communities. Because my concern is that that proprietary value is limited then to the affluent, to those who can afford what tools, what in the agriculture space, what seeds, what opportunities, what new digital tools are then developed out of that system. And so what we're looking to do is, how do we expand the financing, the operational support, the legal support that is necessary to ensure that businesses can broaden the market for the value-driven proprietary benefits that come from the entire ecosystem of those operating in this space for more universal benefit. And as I said, particularly for those that would be in underserved communities or low-income populations. So that I'm fascinated by where this goes, but concerned that unless we can build platforms that provide for universality of these benefits, that we're going to leave even more people behind.
Gotcha, and thank you so much for that. I do have a quick question for you while I ask Shaq to open up his video. And while Shaq is doing that, Erkko, if I may ask you, is there a data grab going on out there?
If I said no, then I'm simply naive. Because of course there is, but the question is who's grabbing and for the benefit of whom?
Yeah, exactly.
If
Good
you
point.
allow me, John, I would make a quick comment in the transition to Jacques. I am on the advisory board of Erkko at the Food System for the Future. Erkko, you can think of the digital aspects, but you can also think about our economy, society as a mixture of platform. And if you want to support those entrepreneurs, this balance, this understanding of how the public, the private, and the common can be redesigned in some novel way, you will never get the scale for your entrepreneur. And that this notion of, and that will be our next webinar, understanding how enterprise is to be revisited. But you cannot answer now, you will have to come back.
No, I was just going to say that is what I hope to talk about a bit more in the later part of the conversation.
Okay. Thank you all so much. So Shaq, if you could take off your speaker, your mic, yeah. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Shaq Wolfert from Wageningen University, where he's a senior research scientist. And Shaq, to be honest, I don't think there's any digital project in Europe that you're not either leading or involved in. You've been involved in the Internet of Food and Farm 2020, the Smart Agri Hubs, and you seem to have a helicopter view as well as a hands-on role with a lot of these projects. So your views on Professor Autio's briefing today are particularly interesting. So over to you for 2 or 3 minutes for your lens on what you saw and what you heard.
Yeah, thank you, John. And also thanks to Professor Autio for his very interesting presentation. I still have to digest it a little bit. But indeed, as John said, I'm working, let's say, in the agri-food software ecosystem, mainly in Europe, through several projects that were mentioned. And it consists of several big and small players. So users and providers of digital solutions, also including several platforms at various levels. So there are app platforms that farmers, so usually farmers are smallholders, small companies that are using apps to support their farm management, but there are also sometimes relatively big trading platforms, for example, where supply and demand of agricultural produce is brought together. And then there are more larger companies involved. And also there is a variety in the openness of the platform. So some of them are quite open, and everybody can offer an application on top of it. And there are also company-based platforms that are owned by a company, and yeah, it's not open for everybody to put an application on that. And sometimes, well, in this ecosystem, we are working with many small players, as well as from the agricultural side, so farmers, for example, but also small software providers, but also very big companies like John Deere or Bayer, just to mention a few. And yeah, what I observed when I was thinking about the subject that you introduced, I think the software development of these platforms and apps is still largely based on commonly available software of these companies that you mentioned, the development platforms of Amazon and Google and Azure. And yeah, and I see that for both big software developers as well as small startups, that they are using those type of platforms. And I'm not really aware of involvement of these companies, especially the large ones like John Deere or Bayer, that they are already into this game, as you call it, co-developing the commons. So what lies beneath these platforms. So yeah, I was wondering, you mainly refer to the large software companies like Google and Facebook that are playing this game, but I'm wondering, and I think you showed already a few examples, but are there also examples of companies from the applied industry side? So for example, in my domain, the John Deere's or the Bayer or Monsanto that are also involved in this. And not, if not, should they also start to play this game? And I think also what Mrs. Cousin was referring to, so I'm on purpose maybe mentioning a few big players in the agricultural ecosystem. So yeah, I see also a danger, and maybe we can come back to that later, that also there it will be the giants in this industry that are taking over, because they are capable and they have the power and the resources to play this game. And yeah, it's also then the question, are many small players not left behind? And also in relation to that, I was also quite surprised maybe by this leading in research on AI of these companies like Facebook and Google. And I was wondering, should governments not invest more in this research?
Yeah, thank you so much, Jacques, for that. Now I have a quick question for you, Jacques, but I want to ask Wally Trentholm to open up his video and get ready for his intro. So Jacques, back to you. With regard to governments investing, is the EU in a leading position now worldwide? Because we see the EU is constantly coming out with its blockchain strategy, and in this week with its digital 2030 strategy. Based on what you're seeing and happening around the world, is the EU leading the way here?
Yeah, I think in some way we can say that we are leading. So maybe we can come back to that later, but I was also quite involved in the development of what is nowadays called FiWare, which is an open source ecosystem for multiple domains. And so they invested quite a lot in this. And I think what you see now, that they're also trying to start to invest in common data spaces, as we call it. Also, yeah, as a kind of reaction to the giants, especially coming from the US, but sometimes also more on the hardware level, when we talk about Huawei. And so, yeah, I don't know if Europe is leading in this, but sure, I agree that they are really keen to invest in this.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much, Jacques. So our last panelist to interpret the keynote is Wally Trentholm. Wally is a senior fellow at CIGI, where he contributes his expertise on artificial intelligence, Wally is also the CEO and founder of Sightline Innovation, and he's done some really, really innovative, first in the world type stuff in the past. So Wally, if you can take yourself off mute, and over to you for 2 or 3 minutes to give your lens on what you saw and heard from the briefing from Professor Autio.
Yeah, no, thanks. Thanks very much. It's an honor to be here. I mean, I think it's a very provocative topic intellectually, the open source conundrum. I've got a bit of a unique perspective on it. So actually, I started my career in 1997 working for the federal government and noticed that we were paying way too much for Oracle licensing. So I proposed that we use a very radical software product called Linux, which I think was in the kernel version of 0.78, and a database called Postgres in 1997 to replace free licensing just going to Oracle. That project, the government actually made me start a company to do that on a wider scale, which became actually, so we did the first open source installations for Bell Canada, for the government of Canada. We were also the first commercial product that we know of in the Python programming language in 2003, which is a very open source language and quite radical in those days. I literally had programmers quit at the idea of programming in an untyped language. And that company was sold to Research in Motion, where it was the first sort of open source injection in that ecosystem. You know, those are different times. I mean, the world's changed a lot since then. The big data companies, you know, have figured out a way to become the biggest companies in the world by giving away the software. And it's caused a lot of disruption combined with the cloud movement, which, you know, is sort of created a strange dynamic where salaries are up and hardware costs are up and software costs are down. And I think, you know, a company even like my own are still trying to make money selling infrastructure that is effectively closed source. You know, we have a specific market niche that I think permits us to do that. But the conversation of open source and how it relates to, you know, an innovation economy in any given country it's a pretty nuanced conversation. And to be honest, I don't think I've ever heard it discussed in an open platform before all across the country. I have private conversations with the CTO at the digital supercluster of Guinea, and we talk about this stuff all the time. And, you know, it's a topic that's not talked about very often, although Professor Dubé has mentioned that I need to start thinking on it. You know, I think that the world is different now, and this topic is very important to understand what the economic development and individual companies, what their strategy is. I don't think there's a clear answer for it. I think that we are a closed source company, although we're launching an open source effort around the DeFi space, which was cited in the chat. Canada doesn't have a lot of open source presence. So, I mean, out of all the big open source projects, Kubernetes, Python interpreter, whatever it is, there's many of them. There's a great indexing engine now with GitLab owned by Microsoft now. But Canada's participation in it, I think, is actually pretty low. We probably have a lot of Canadians participating on behalf of foreign companies. But anyways, I believe that, you know, this is all part of the shift in economy around the value being in the data. You know, that's what drives the balance sheet value up on these big companies. And so we've got this, you know, dilemma of how is it that we can claw some of that back. Healthcare example, a great example. What do you think the national value is of healthcare data in the Canadian healthcare system? You know, it would probably take a big chunk of our tax bill down if we could figure out how to monetize it. And same for health, because with agri-food, because it obviously relates to health. I think this is the challenge of this decade for Canada. Anyways, I know it's an international audience, but for Canada, I think this is the challenge. We have data assets. How can we claw some of that value back? And undoubtedly, that is going to be required that we participate in the commons, and we need complicated, sophisticated thinking and coordination to figure out how to do that for the best benefit of national and you know, stakeholders all around.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that, Wally. What I'd like to do is ask Professor Autio to open up his video again to respond to the comments from the panelists. But before I ask Professor Autio to comment, I want to go to Professor Sandra Schillo. And Sandra, can you turn on your video? I believe you have a question. Good morning. You're in Ottawa?
Yes. Hi, so I'm Sandra Schillo. I'm a professor at the Telford School of Management, and I'm also with the Institute for Science, Society and Policy at the University of Ottawa. Yeah, actually, thanks, John. I didn't quite know you were going to call me right now. Really good points here. Just to Wally and to bring it back to Erkko here. I think some of this conversation actually has been happening quite a bit, for example, on the tech transfer or technology kind of management side of things in that space. I know that 20 years ago at NRC, we were having these kind of discussions as to, you know, capturing the value from open source versus closed technologies. What I think has changed, in addition to, Wally, what you just said in terms of the data and data being available, I think there's also a layer that Erkko got at, and I think that's a really, really important layer that has been perhaps not quite as emphasized in this conversation so far. I think there's a social layer that comes with it as well. And I think Erkko's work is really amazing in highlighting the ecosystem concept of it. For example, this recent paper that highlights the three different streams of the ecosystem work, I think really kind of brings out the context as well. And I'm kind of seeing, in addition to the infrastructure layer and the software layer and so on, I see a social layer that actually builds on that, because the ecosystems are actually connecting people as well. And that's where the convergence of the social and the economic value comes in. And Erkko really opened up, I think, that thinking here in our conversation, and bringing it back to kind of the broader food security concept and so on. So I think there's a layer that we have to really consider here and add into the discussion about the social side of the ecosystems. And then because I think that's a key step in capturing the value from the technical ecosystem levels.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Now, for the benefit of the audience, Sandra had no idea I was going to ask her to ask a question. So thank you for jumping in with that. So Professor Autio, over to you. If you have just for a couple of minutes, if you can comment on anything that jumped out to you as something that's relevant, needs more research, or needs more thinking and dialogue.
Thank you. Well, that's a big ask, because there were so many insightful questions and commentaries, all of which I agree. Maybe I should briefly start. Well, one thing is that we are talking about the highly complex phenomenon, obviously, and that is a multifaceted phenomenon, and the impacts through which, or the channels through which the commons conversion feeds back to the real economy and society are likely to be many, and there are going to be many different forms, and we are going to see some anticipated effects, but we are also going to see a lot of unanticipated ones. So it's a very, very complex thing, and I don't think anyone really knows what's going to happen. The comment on the social layer is one that I very much agree, because when we are talking about complex phenomenon that affects the entire society, because the internet is everywhere, and those digital infrastructures are everywhere, they surround us, we can't escape from them. So this phenomenon naturally speaks to also to the notion of wiki challenges, where you need to try to develop solutions to complex societal problems that touch many independent stakeholders who each need to take adaptive action for those solutions to become viable. So you are trying to manage the development of solutions while you are trying to prepare ground for the acceptance of those solutions through adaptive action. And this is where I believe the social layer has a big impact to deliver, where it is particularly relevant. There was a notion of data, and obviously data is a big issue in supply chains, and especially for IIoT, because that data is commercially sensitive for those who own it. Are they happy to part with their data and share that with IIoT suppliers, and to what extent is that going to happen, and is that going to become open? I think there are many unknowns there, how that aspect is going to play out. Maybe I should just comment on, this notion of ensuring equitability is a very important one. And again, there are kind of positives, and then there are also some disconcerting effects. So I believe the tension between public and private is always going to be there, and what's happening with the current developments, there are many of which are kind of a channel through the internet and through the digital infrastructure, that the tension between public and private is going to be there. It's going to take new forms, and how do we make sure that no one is left behind? On the one hand, we see kind of encouraging developments when, for example, AI is open first. It's open from the outset and accessible to everyone, but that also means that everyone can access it and then start using it for their own purposes, and then we might see some unanticipated outcomes emerging that we couldn't really expect, as we have seen with the internet and with the social media. We have seen all kinds of anticipated effects. We thought that with the internet, information will be more freely accessible to everyone, and actually what we have seen is the opposite, and we have seen the formation of these bubbles that create their own information universes, and that are not compatible across the bubbles. So a big phenomenon, but certainly many interesting things going on in there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. Now, Professor Autio, we're going to rest your voice box for the next 30 minutes. And we're going to go into the round robin, 2 rounds of round robin. So we'll have about 15 minutes each for each round, where I'll ask the panelists a question. And we'll follow the same pattern as previously. We'll go alphabetically by first name. So guess who's up? Branimir, if you can come off mute. And my question for you is, you have a lot of experience now, I think almost 10 years experience in building food supply chains and making them as transparent and trusted as possible. But how do you see all of these individual solutions merging together in what we call the future digital economy, and what I prefer to call the future digital ecosystems rather than supply chains? So we have this notion of supply chains that are linear, but I think we shouldn't really think about linear supply chains anymore. We should think more of ecosystem. How do you see it all coming together?
That's a very good question, John. And it's obviously a multi-layered problem. So I'll try to explain very briefly what we've encountered so far, and what has been very helpful, where we believe the ecosystem needs to move. One of the key issues, like I said, is, and also Professor Autio mentioned very briefly in the case of these big technological platforms, is the technology has been evolving in such a way that you kind of have this emergent property of data being sort of closed in to walled gardens, be that social networks or large enterprises, but also in supply chains. Even the IoT data mentioned, getting usually fed into some certain system. It's very hard to port it or send it over or just integrate it with other data in order to get this full visibility. And as you said, supply chains are not really chains, they turn into networks, and quite often these actors in these networks don't really have awareness of each other, not even knowing, obviously. So the idea there being that we believe that this emergent new era of what is called the Web3, or the semantic web, which has 2 key components, really interoperability on the data level. So we're no longer database centric, but rather data and knowledge oriented throughout. And also the notion, obviously, of trust, which is necessarily needed. So these systems need to learn, the existing systems need somehow to learn in a technological sense, how to speak to each other, understand each other, but also how and when to trust each other. And this is what we've been really working on from the get-go. We started in food supply chains, but actually expanded quite further because the same infrastructure, software infrastructure can be used across different supply chains. And the cases we had so far, we've been working mostly in the dairy, poultry industry, and vegetable industry as well. It's really always been a challenge to get all these legacy systems talking together. There's several very interesting emerging technologies. Some of them go into the category of blockchain, both in those open, completely permissionless variants, but also, let's say, more permissioned and closed systems. And I would argue that they are very useful, but they are not the silver bullet. Blockchain is not going to be the solution for this whole problem of interoperability, interconnectivity, and really integrity. It helps with integrity a lot, but other solutions that are focused and data-centric, such as knowledge graphs, are something that I believe is going to be the emerging common infrastructure. It's actually already emerging and mostly used by these major companies that we sort of mentioned, Google, Facebook, Uber, all of these, even NASA, they all use knowledge graphs to a certain extent to integrate data within their own organization and make some more value out of it. That's why we are building an open source version of that and actually making it a knowledge graph of knowledge graphs, something that would integrate this information. And that's applicable not just to supply chains in terms of food, but also other types of industries where it enables a very interesting paradigm. We tend to think as data being either fully public or fully private. This enables the integration of both because it enables this interconnectivity. So that would mean, for a very simple example, if I were a farmer and I had some IoT devices on my farm, I would be able to retain the value from the data that gets generated by actually owning all this data in my personal or farm private section of the knowledge graph, and I would be able to monetize it utilizing novel technologies like blockchain. And essentially, this is where I believe these technologies will converge. They will be built on open standards, such as GS1 standards for supply chain, which we've been leveraging for a long time and actually part of working groups developing them. So open standards in terms of getting the interoperability on the data level, open source technology as being able to openly use it by anyone and not having to pay the enormous fees that were mentioned by certain companies. And then finally, converging this with the integrity that open platforms can provide, such as blockchain.
Thank you so much for that, Branimir. That intervention is really insightful. Dennis, if I may ask you to open up your video, please. So Dennis, what I want to do is build on your comments earlier and what Branimir just talked about. What do you see as the greatest opportunity to start integrating these platforms using some of the conversations that we had today? You mentioned that, you know, you went through internationalization and you went through mergers and acquisitions. What is your perspective on what is the near-hanging fruit or the low-hanging fruit for organizations like yours to adopt more of these platforms to drive that integration?
Sure. So I think, you know, we're constantly pushing our platforms and our softwares to talk to each other. I talked a little bit about cold chain technology, and that's certainly something where we're doing a lot of work, both with, again, very advanced companies that are developing algorithms to predict days of freshness, and very basic companies that have monitored our the temperature in our assets for sometimes as long as decades, connecting those in an end-to-end, you know, farm to shelf cold chain platform by adding sensors, not wholeheartedly replacing everything we already have in place, and then drawing insight from that, I think is going to go a long way towards maintaining better freshness, reducing spoilage, reducing carbon footprint, all of that. Additionally, where I'd really like to see us do some work is, I mentioned that we were looking at our forecasting and replenishment software that really needs to connect to better order management and sourcing software. So I use the example during the pandemic, we had some successes and some losses where we worked with companies that we normally don't work with to source product, companies that normally go to restaurants rather than supermarkets. Restaurants were closed and we were open and we needed product pretty badly. So that was a success, and we were able to do that. But we also, in the newspaper, read about a lot of failures in the food system during the pandemic of animals being slaughtered without processing capacity, of milk and produce being just wasted due to lack of transportation or processing capacity. And we need platforms, sourcing and order management platforms that connect us more dynamically and solve those problems. And then, also when that's also helpful when we're not in a pandemic, because if you talk to the heads of merchandising of all my stores, you talk to them about local production, small local production, and this is very much to Erthurin's point. If we could get 5 times as much local production on our shelves, we would sell it without a problem. But we can't, because so many of those local producers are Amish, and they don't do an EDI exchange with a legacy system. At best, they can be expected to use their neighbor's phone, or have their neighbor do a basic upload to a website. Very, very basic. So what is the food connection system that allows me to source from that local Amish farmer, but also allows me to communicate with somebody like Dole or Green Giant and adjust my order from Dole because I can get the order from the farmer? That I'm very interested in seeing where that goes and working on platforms that allow that kind of flexibility.
Thank you, Dennis. I do have a quick question for you while I invite Erthurin back. And my quick question for you, and you can decline to answer this question if you want, but I get frustrated every now and again when I see companies saying that we can track from farm to fork. Now, and I know that retailers don't always know who buys the product. A lot of products are bought anonymously.
I was very specific. I said farm to shelf.
You said farm to shelf. You didn't say this. Now you didn't say this. But yeah. In general, my general question to you: do retailers know who bought products in retail?
More and more often, yes. Loyalty programs are extremely powerful connections with the customer. So not only do we know who bought product, but we also know what product people are likely to buy and what products people buy in pairs and things like that. Where we don't have full traceability is at the lot level. So I can tell that you bought lettuce from a store on a date. If I have multiple lots of product in the store, I can't tell if you bought the tainted lot of lettuce. And in fact, I can't track that from the DC. So I know which of my distribution, and this is pretty universal in the grocery industry. We know which lot hit which distribution center. We don't often know which lot hit which store and beyond, and that's changing. We're getting more and more traceability. Will we get traceability to the customer's fork? Not soon. Yeah. Not at the lot level.
Exactly, and I think that's a very important point, because the COVID pandemic has actually been a boon for traceability, because on top of the loyalty programs, consumers were buying online. And for traceability to work, you need 3 Ps. You need the product, you need the party, the customer, and you need the premise, which is the forwarding premise. And I read recently that in the US, there's still close to 30% of retail transactions are actually cash transactions. So I wanted to point that out, that we can't always assume that we can do farm to fork when a lot of transactions are private, are anonymous. And in context of open source technologies like blockchain and others, the focus from the EU now is how do we protect the privacy of consumers as we build this digital future. So thank you, Dennis, for addressing that. Erkko, thank you so much for coming back online. So your organization is looking at the future of food. How are you embracing not only systems thinking, but also extracting the full value of convergence innovation to deliver not only financial results, but also benefits at the nutrition level? And Dennis actually hinted to this one around systems thinking, the importance of that, because we do have failures that can cascade.
Well, thank you very much for that question. And the reality of it is, when we think about, historically, when you think about investments, whether funds often think about investing in one company and how they drive their returns. We recognize if we want to make food systems changes and changes that impact nutrition, particularly changes that impact nutrition, we must think in a systems way. And that means not just providing the financial capital for supporting for a particular company, but the partnerships, whether those are public sector, private sector partnerships, that will ensure the answer to the questions that Dennis asked. Where's the partnership with those Amish farmers to ensure that they can access grocery retailers despite their religious challenges related to technology? So how do you develop the partnerships and the partnerships that would support their ability to serve a retail customer? So that public-private partnership with to support the business enterprises, public-private partnerships that support the right policies and regulations to ensure greater access. One of the other challenges that we identified during COVID was the lack of regional slaughterhouses and other animal processing facilities that in the United States that were directly related to the types of regulatory requirements that limited the development of those types of facilities. And so creating more local production of product will require changing the regulatory frame that will provide the space for the enabling environment for the development of those kinds of businesses. There's no one business that can provide that kind of support to ensure their ability to make the kinds of changes in the food system that are necessary. So what we have done with Food Systems for the Future is to create that platform that will provide that partnership, that policy, the research and information necessary for a company to leapfrog challenges of operations, as well as the finances and operational support. Using that platform of activities will ensure our ability to support not just one company, but the companies across the food system, from the production to consumers. Because the other challenge that you have on the other end is, even if we produce healthier foods, we know that without consumer demand and consumer behavior change, you will not have consumption of those more nutritious, less calorie dense products. And so unless you have simultaneous activity that is occurring, and no one organization is going to have the capacity to perform all that work, which is why ecosystems are so critical, with partners across the entire food chain supporting those different variables that are necessary to create the dynamics of the type of food system that we hope to achieve, that will change both the human health and provide both the changes that are necessary for human health and planetary health.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that, Erkko. And I'm going to make a quick comment before we go on to Shaq for his question. And, you know, we observed during the pandemic, and this goes back to Professor Schillow's comment earlier about social systems. We know that from social science, and this wasn't included in retailers and manufacturers' conversations, but we know from social science that consumers have predictable behavior when faced with an existential threat. So while we all looked at consumers and said, you know, you're doing something bad here, you're doing panic buying, in fact, it wasn't selfishness, it was helplessness that was driving them. The key point here is that we need to also embrace social science to understand the social systems and how they operate and be able to react, because in the context of COVID, when the middle part of the supply chain breaks down and the factories, the processing factories are closed, the farmers are still feeding the pigs. But guess what? When you keep feeding the pigs beyond 7 days, the pig becomes so big that they actually don't fit in the pens at the slaughterhouses. And we know that, you know, hundreds of thousands of animals were slaughtered. So it's a knock-on effect. So the points that, you know, that Erkko raised around systems thinking is absolutely critical because they have a knock-on effect. So Shaq, with that as an intro, I'm going to go over to you. And as we know, you work on the agri-food domain and digital innovation. But what are the main challenges and bottlenecks in relation to getting these digital ecosystems up and running, especially when you have all of these, you know, a multi-tenant approach, which could be, you know, from the public and private sector?
Yeah, thank you for that question, John. And I think also the previous panelists also touched upon a lot of things that I was wanting to say to answer to this question. But I think, one of the main challenges is that, as well in the technical sense as an organizational sense, there's still a lot of fragmentation. So it's if you look to the whole agri-food domain, it's a very complex system. If you talk about greenhouses or pig farmers or retailers, these are quite different type of players, and it's looking at the whole supply chain or the supply chain network, as you indicated. It's quite difficult to overcome this fragmentation in a technical sense. So I see also still a lot of challenges talking about interoperability and these legacy systems. So I would say also in relation to Professor Autio's presentation, I think they are not yet ready, most of the players over there, to start playing these games on the commons because they have to play many other games before they get there. And I think it's also important to highlight or to emphasize this social dimension, and that's what we especially are working on in our projects. So we adopted the multi-actor approach that was more or less invented by the European Commission. So we have a very multi-actor collaborative approach in our projects where several players or actors are working together on developing the right solutions. And there it is the challenge to create minimum viable ecosystems, which also means that you find shared business cases for the users, but also business models for the technology providers. And at the same time, what I was also referring to previously, we also see in the agri-food domain, the challenge or the threat that there will be the big players that will have an advantage in developing advanced technologies like AI in the future, but also now when you talk about big data analytics and that kind of things. I hear also that the small players, the users, are afraid of all kind of vendor lock-ins. So that's also a reason why they're interested somehow in this open source movement or development. But yeah, as I said, it's still difficult for most of them to be aware, to understand what's really going on over there. But yeah, that is also something we try to support in our projects, which are also supported or funded by the European Commission, to work on issues like data governance. So it's about data sovereignty against balancing this with innovation. And we have also special working groups on values and ethics that are behind this development. But yeah, at the same time, I have to admit that we are working in big projects and we have quite a lot of players involved. But usually we are working, for example, with farmers that are really the front runners, and they're just a handful of them that are aware of all these developments. But the majority really doesn't have a clue what is going on, and maybe they use some kind of software systems already, and maybe some IoT even. But they, yeah, as I said, they if you tell them about this game that is going on the comments, I think, well, we really need to do some more awareness raising on that.
Good. Thank you so much for that, Shaq. Now I'm going to ask Wally to open up his video. And for all of the panelists, instead of going into a very deliberate session, because the last 10 minutes we want to reserve for the keynote and for Professor Dubé. So I will be asking you one more round of questions in 1 minute, and you can talk about anything you want to talk about in that 1 minute. Now back over to Wally for 2 or 3 minutes. Just specifically for you, do you think it's feasible and achievable to get to open source in AI and really make some significant changes? If you look at your experience in innovating and literally breaking the old models, what do you see are the key things that need to occur to allow that or facilitate that?
Yeah, well, I mean, artificial intelligence was basically always born in open source. So I think the most significantly impactful open source project in Canadian history, which was end of life in 2018, is a project called Theano, which is a export from the great city of Montreal and the University of Montreal under the leadership of Dr. Ushio Bengio. Ultimately, that technology was probably, in my opinion, I think it was rolled in TensorFlow, but artificial intelligence algorithmically, is quite open. I think it always has been. I think that no one's going to be successful in closing that particular door right now. It's the data side of it that is sort of where the question comes in. I would actually just throw something from the comment, because I think it's very related, very much so on the data side, which is what feeds into the infrastructure that you use to feed into AI. Tyrone asks, and I didn't open the link, and I understand that it was commented we didn't have time, but I'm familiar with this issue. So Elasticsearch was a previously open source technology, an indexing engine, which is highly got a lineage of being open source, pulling from projects, I believe, going back 20 years. The company that led it, which was a commercial company offering commercial support for it, recently closed sourced their product. We use ES, so Elasticsearch is a very commonly used thing. We use it. They closed the source of it and it got forked, meaning there's a split, and now there's a closed source version. And of course, someone can pick up the open source work. AWS did that. I find it interesting because AWS has a long history of basically, leveraging open source technology and not putting out their own. But it forces people like us, so we're going to end up using the open source version. And it's a great example of sort of the nuance. I mean, AWS can afford to do that because they've got a great dominance in the cloud space. The small company that from Elasticsearch, they're kind of like us, similar type of thing. The decision to close source, on the surface, I can totally understand why they did it. And they might actually be successful at it. But I think it's a little bit, I don't see AWS as the white knight in shining armor at all. I mean, Google, it puts out a ton of open source software, so does Facebook, Microsoft as well. Amazon does not, in my opinion. But in this case, they're going to pick up the tab, which is great. I think in order to help all these things on the open source side, as Canadians, we actually do need government support explicitly. I've been wrestling with this issue for my own company. I've always sort of maintained the position. If we can find the support to make an open source component, we'll do it. But it's not something that comes at no cost. Like, in order to do open source right, it actually takes investment. And if you don't have the revenue base to really support it, there's kind of, a catch-22. So, government support, I think in this area, with IRAP and all these different great support programs that we have, perhaps there should be an open source mandate in there. On the surface, it sounds supportive. It sounds like something I'd probably support.
Gotcha. Thanks so much for that clarity, Wally. And I do agree with you that government support as an enabler can be important. And also, we need to think about ethical AI in context of the algorithms and so on. So for 1 minute, I'm going to go to each panelist for 1 minute, and no longer than 1 minute, I'm going to time you. So Branimir, if I go to you in 1 minute, you can talk about anything you want in 1 minute. And you're on mute.
Yeah, I would just maybe like to underline the key points I got from this discussion, and that I completely agree with, is that one of the most important things is that building these new ecosystems, be they on any sort of level of the game, needs to be inclusive. And in that regard, that's where we've had a lot of experience with the standards that I mentioned. Also interoperable. And where we discuss all of these topics that are concerning both legacy systems, but also just generally any system. And then one of the key things that we didn't get to touch, which I would just like to touch upon, apart from also being open source, is being allowing permissionless innovation. And that's where the DLT space is very interesting, because it allows it provides an open network that anybody can participate in, be that data sharing or creating certain even DeFi projects that we briefly mentioned. And I think the key difference that we're going to see in the coming period is going to be the notion of getting privacy and data ownership as one of the key primitives in that regard, on what really is going to be the building block for these new systems. This is how we will get companies motivated to share their data, rather than accumulated by some big systems. They would be able to actually exchange using the same technology as these big players among each other and monetize it. And that requires data ownership and privacy, also standardized systems. And finally, I'm a big believer that this will be an open source thing. There's a lot of very interesting projects around this space. So Origin Trail being one of them, the one that we're building. So yeah, anybody interested in further discussing such topics that I just mentioned, I'm very eager to continue that also after this panel.
Wonderful. You owe me 1 minute in a future panel, okay? Dennis, over to you. 1 minute, whatever you want to talk about.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the discussion. I really enjoyed hearing from everybody. I think this is exactly the type of thing that highlights how important it is for industry to connect with academia. We're just doing the work every day. I don't think we've ever thought about, do we think about systems or platforms, or do we think about just traditional tools? We've just kind of slowly moved, and I think having a forum like this to collate that discussion is very helpful, and it gives me kind of the language and the context as I'm going back to my leadership to bring in new technologies to talk about it in a better framework. And then secondly, I'll just mention that being in food supply chain and being in the food industry in general is such a part of everybody's day and everybody's life. That it's a higher calling, and we have to think about things like bringing in the local farmers, platforms for donating food, both not just food that is ending its near entering the waste stream, but food that is new and good and healthy and getting to people on time. You know, moving that donation upstream and moving that waste cycle upstream. So, you know, it's a privilege to be in the industry and a privilege to think about stuff like that.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dennis, for that. Erkko, over to you for 1 minute for your closing comments.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you to all of you for including me, especially to you, Dr. Dubé. Appreciate you very much. That doesn't count for my 1 minute. Let me just say quickly what a pleasure it is to be on a panel that everyone agrees that inclusivity is a key and a required factor for all of the decision making around these issues in the future. And inclusivity must not only include interoperability, but also ensuring the financial investment that is necessary, both in the platforms to support the type of change that we seek to achieve, but also in different businesses and enterprises that can drive that change. And that will ensure that will require that we not think about the social aspect here, and the changes that we're hoping to make only in a philanthropic sphere, but also as business opportunities. So we need blended capital that includes both grant and philanthropic capital, but also investment willing to take risk to achieve that inclusivity that we all agree that we want to achieve.
Fantastic, and thank you so much for that intervention, Erkko. Shaq, over to you, 1 minute.
Yeah, thank you, John. I was also already mentioning before the Fireware initiative that was launched in 2010, initiated by the European Commission, setting the rules for the game, but it was picked up by the large companies like Telefonica, Atos, and Orange, together with public research institutes, and it ended up in the Fireware Foundation, which issues and develops also together with the open source community these generic enablers. So I see that they can play a role, so they have a strong position to play this game and co-developing the commons, as Professor Autio was referring to, and to be an agent also for multiple domains. But looking back to that, I think there was a nice interplay between governments and large companies, resulting into something that I think is still promising. And that was more on software development, but as we agreed, data as the new challenge, and with these common data spaces, I was also mentioning that the European Commission is now looking at. I hope we can have a similar development. So in general, I would plead, referring to Professor Autio's speech, to see if we can have more government involvement in this game, especially in trying to set the rules.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Shaq. So, Wally, if you can turn on your video and your final comments in 1 minute.
Actually, sorry, I think my video faulted out somewhere here. Yeah, I mean, final comments are, again, I think it's a very, it's a nuanced discussion. It's an economic development discussion. I think that the labor force is strongly benefited by having, domestic open source projects in its region. Right now you get this effect where the labor prices shot up, that foreign companies can handle it, local companies can't. And they're the ones that are offering open source jobs where your credentials live on GitHub. I look at people when I hire. The easiest way for me to hire someone is if I can go in their GitHub account and see what they've contributed to. And I can't tell you how many times I'm looking to hire someone to work with some open source project, and I just dream of being able to get a hold of those contributors. I think we're missing out, and I think it needs to be addressed through policy and support from ISED or whoever's responsible for that going forward. I don't think we're going to get there on our own. I think that we've proven that as a country. And again, I'm sorry for having Canadian focused comments, but that might play well in other jurisdictions as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that, Wally. If I can ask Professor Autio to come back on, and before we address the final comments, I would like to sincerely thank, on behalf of myself and Professor Dubé and Kitty and the team at McGill, we would like to thank Branimir, Dennis, Ertharin, Shaq, and Wally for joining us today for this brilliant panel discussion. So I want to pass now to Professor Autio in just give you a couple of minutes just to do a summary, and then Professor Dubé will take over in the last minute or so and do the closing.
Okay, I'll time myself. So there really seems to be two dynamics there. On the one hand, you have the commons dynamic, and on the other hand, you have the data dynamic and related AI dynamics and all of that. And commons dynamic is likely to influence how we innovate, how we create novelty in these complex systems that we live in, whereas data enables us to coordinate and predict and enhance coordination capabilities across systems. So that's one of the observations I made. We are trying to manage this complex dynamic for two purposes. So we are trying to both maximize business value and our ability to maximize business value, while also not losing sight on the creation of societal value. And we have two macro level value production dynamics that we need to coordinate in this complex world that we live in. Important technical trends that we need to pay attention to are distributed ledgers, commons and open source. We have the data and related AI dynamics, and then we have blockchain somewhere, lurking somewhere in the background. Something to keep in mind. Greater predictive ability through AI enhances our systems coordination ability, so there's some hope for the government. One discussion that we didn't really touch on was the difference between EU, US, Canada, and country like China. China is great at AI, but China tends to be fairly weak on the common side of things. And that's something to consider. What will that happen? The COVID crisis really has brought forth the need to coordinate across multiple interlocked systems in the presence of legacy systems and managing those. Finally, the limitations of lean entrepreneurship and lean innovation heuristics are poorly suited to coordinating solutions to wicked challenges, which is really something we need to develop.
Fantastic. And thank you so much, Professor Autio, for a brilliant intervention today. And thank you again to all the panelists. Professor Dubé, if you can do the closing and your comments.
Thank you very much to all of you, to Erkko, and to John, for those 2 hours that have been so enriching in so many ways in moving toward this convergence between science and action, but also, and most importantly, between our machine of development that we have been putting out there, the private, the civil, the academic, and the government. And I think that what the insights from Erkko's work, as well as from all the panelists, is to bring us at a point of mankind that I believe we can tweak a bit our model. A lot of it can be enabled with the data and with the digital and so on, but this combination of both machine and human intelligence and creativity and empathy, that makes me an eternal optimist in moving toward this convergence. Our next webinar of convergence innovation will be, Kitty, can you put up the slides, please? Will be on March 31st, and it will be this time by I cannot see her name, Nidhi Nunelli. And one of the key parts here is convergence innovation, as I keep repeating, is building convergence economy where the developed and developing countries are on the same planet. And our keynote, who comes more from an industry background this time, has just completed extremely interesting analysis of next generation entrepreneur in Africa. That is, in some way, I was giving a keynote last week on some development. And can we use COVID for a world reset toward convergence economy? And I think starting maybe by looking at the power of entrepreneurship, whether we are in Africa, Canada, USA, there is something about what drives entrepreneur that can be capitalized upon. And those entrepreneurs, you don't get just the commercial, the social, and the institutional. That's really, the panel will be built to see to what extent we can harness the power of human entrepreneurship to create, with the same digital power and so on and so forth, entrepreneurial ecosystem that allow us to tweak our model of modernity. So this is what you do here. It's not the right March 22nd. Nidhi will launch her book at that time, and she will be giving, and you look at Trin, if you look at your food security, you get kind of a build-up there of moving toward really having not just talking, but transforming. So it will be March 31st, same time, that we will be having our next FCI webinar. Thank you, Erkko. Thank you, John. Thank you, everybody. You have been wonderful. Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.